Hello everyone, welcome to our talk about national income accounting. Now, let me first start off by saying national income accounting is a fancy way of saying the process in which we try to measure the economy. So basically, national income accounting is a way we calculate GDP, gross domestic product. So, with that being said, in a previous video, I kind of gave you an idea of how we measure the economy. And basically, we have to focus on something that can represent economic activity, and that something is output. So national income accounting simply refers to measuring economic activity, aggregate economic activity. And in particular, the activity is going to be production, output. And so the official name for this measurement of measuring output is gross domestic product. And gross domestic product is basically the value of final output produced within our nation's borders. Now, there's a couple of terms here to focus on. One, dollar value. The other one, output, final output. And the other one, within a nation's borders. So basically what we're saying is we're going to use output to represent activity, and we only want to count the activity within a specific boundary, a nation, so to speak. And notice how when I say count output, most people think again, if you use the analogy of counting activity within a factory, if we're going to use output to represent activity, you would simply count the number of, let's say, cars being produced every month. If you produce more cars, there's more activity. Fine. The problem is a country is not like a factory. A country, we produce a lot more things, a variety of things within a country's borders than you would within the confines of a factory. So we can't just count physical units. What we do is we want to count the units produced within a nation's borders, but we want to give each unit weight for the activity it took to bring that unit to market. This is why we look at the dollar value of the final output. You could see here, if we just count physical items, oranges, bicycles, rock concerts, okay, well that's what? 2,200,000,700 items. But that's not really going to give us an idea of how much activity it took, because it takes more activity to put on one concert than it does to produce one orange. So what we do is, instead of just counting units, what we do is we take the units, as you can see here, but we also multiply it by the sale price. The presumption is the sale price is a way to tell you how much activity it took to bring oranges to market and how much it took to bring each concert to market. So if we multiply the output by the sale price, we get the dollar value. This is why we report GDP in monetary terms and not in physical units. Until recently, when I say recently, I'm sorry, until the 1990s, the United States used to measure the economy, economic activity, with something called gross national product, GNP. Now, the big difference between GNP and GDP is GDP cares where the item is produced. In other words, we only want to count output within, let's say, the United States borders. We don't care who owns the factory producing the output, we just care where it's produced. GNP cares who owns the factory. We don't care where it was produced. So in other words, a US factory operating in Mexico would be counted towards GNP, but that U.S. factory operating in Mexico would not be counted towards GDP. So let me give you an example. Let's look at the the GDP for China. So here's China, and I've got three factories producing output. One factory, this factory in China is owned by a US citizen. This factory in China is owned by a Chinese national. And finally, this factory in India is owned by a Chinese national. Now, for GDP, for Chinese GDP, you only want to count output produced within a nation's borders. So we would count the output coming out of these two factories, but not this factory. Even though this factory is owned by a Chinese citizen, it's not operating within the boundaries of the Chinese country. Now, GNP, we would not count the factory in China owned by an American citizen, but we would count the output produced in India owned by a Chinese citizen. So that's the difference between GDP and GNP. GDP cares where the output is produced. GNP cares who owns the factors of production. Now, if we want to compare economies between countries, we would be comparing GDP. Now, the issue here is GDP in the United States is measured in US dollars. GDP in, let's say, France is measured in euros. So if we want to have a comparison between US GDP and French GDP, we would have to convert each country's GDP into a common currency in order to make that comparison. So in this particular case, let me just move this down a little bit. Right. Here we have 2023, and you can see the relative size in each country's GDP in US dollar terms. And this is in trillions of dollars. So in 2023, United States had about a $22 trillion economy. China was in second place with 17.2 trillion. And then there's a big drop off to number 3, Japan. And these are all measured in US dollars. And you can see that basically it's kind of a two-tier global economy in terms of two very large economies, and then what we would call middle-tier economies. So this gives you an idea of the level of activity taking place within each country's borders. Now, I like this graph. Instead of looking at dollar terms or monetary terms within a country's borders, why don't we look at GDP per kilometer? Now, keep in mind, this is rather old data, but it gets across the idea that not all parts of the country have the same level of activity taking place. So let's take a look at the United States. The darker red colors means there's more GDP per kilometer than those in the lighter yellow colors. So you could see activity is concentrated along the east coast of the United States and on the west coast of the United States. Not much going on here. This is the Rocky Mountain area. And you could take a look at a country, let's say like Australia is an extreme example, where there's a lot of activity going on the east coast, but not much else within Australia. And Japan has high concentration of GDP in almost every part of the country's borders. This graph basically shows you how the activity in the world has changed over time. You could see in 1980, roughly 50% of world GDP was concentrated in only 7 countries: United States, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, United Kingdom, and Canada. And over time, their share of world GDP dropped from 50% to a little bit under 40%. Now, does that mean these countries are producing fewer things? No, it simply means that other countries were growing more rapidly during this time period, and started to represent a larger and larger share of overall GDP. And you can see those countries sometimes referred to BRICS, BRIC countries. The BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And you could see in 1980, these four countries, even though they represent a lot of people, represented only about 13% of global GDP. And as time goes on, they now represent, well, in 2010, they represent 25%. And that number today is much higher than it is in 2010. So basically what we're saying is the level of activity has shifted from these groups of countries to these groups of countries. Now what we can do is we could take GDP, the value of all output, and if we divide that by a country's population, we'll have average output per person. And sometimes that's called per capita GDP. Now, this is a way of measuring standard of living in a country because the value of all output has to equal all of the income earned in the production of that output. So per capita GDP is another way of measuring average income within a country. Now, keep in mind, when you look at average income within the country, averages can be deceiving because a lot of people take averages to try to get a picture of the typical person in a particular country. But if you have high degrees of income concentration within a country, meaning there's a few people who have a lot of the income, those people will skew the average. In other words, they'll make the average not very representative of the typical person. So when you ever look at per capita data, you also have to look at how concentrated the income is within a country to get a more accurate picture of the typical person in that country. And what we can do is we could take the list of countries we saw before, the 10 largest economies, and what we could do is we could divide, for example, we could divide the $22 trillion figure for the United States, divide that by the US population. And you would get an average income or per capita GDP of about $65,000. The UK would be coming in second at 47,000. But look at China. Even though China was the second largest economy in that figure in terms of overall size, they're much smaller because they have a much larger population than the United States. Now, measuring GDP is very straightforward. I mean, why we're measuring GDP is very straightforward. We simply want to get an idea of the level of activity happening with a nation's borders. But it's easier said than done. There's a few problems associated with calculating GDP. One, there is some activity, production, that's not measured or is mismeasured. And sometimes we use the term non-market activities. Basically, if you're doing something illegal, you don't want the government to know about it, therefore you don't report that activity to the data gathering agencies. Therefore, it's not reflected in GDP numbers. And there are some economists that do try to measure the size of the underground economy. And it's difficult because a lot of people who are operating in the underground economy don't like to have their activities widely publicized, right? So how do we measure that? Well, here is an estimate of the size of the underground economy as a percentage of the reported economy. So for example, there is a group of countries called the OECD countries. OECD stands for Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And these are 30 countries who are usually what we call mature economies or developed economies. And this group here, on average, the underground economy represents about 16% or 17% of the overall economy. That means basically 1 out of 7 dollars are not reported to the government. And you can see Greece has a much higher percentage than the average. Roughly almost 30% of the Greek economy is not reported because it's in the underground portion of it. And for the United States, it's relatively low, about 8.7%. Now, what about Asian economies? The average is much higher than OECD countries. The average for Asian countries is about 31%, ranging from a high of 54%, half of the Thai economy is not reported, to the low of 13.7% in Singapore. For African countries, look at this, the average 42% of all activity is not reported in African countries, with a high of 61% in Zimbabwe and a low of 29% in South Africa. Now, how do you measure the underground economy? Well, there is an economist, Frederick Schneider, who does try to do this. He could basically use the direct approach, which is ask people, they don't like to answer it, or they could use the indirect approach, and this is pretty much the approach he uses. Now, the indirect approach is basically you could look at things like you could look at the data on cash transactions compared to electricity consumption or other output figures. For example, if you have relatively little activity being reported, but there's a lot of energy consumption going on, well, that must mean that energy consumption is going towards some sort of activity. Therefore, the activity must be underreported. Another one is you look at cash on hand. Average cash on hand can give you an idea if there's a lot of unreported income going on. For example, let's say in the United States, let's say the average cash on hand is $8,000. Now, do you have $8,000 in your wallet? Do you have $8,000 in your house, cash? Most people do not. But people who are operating in the underground economy tend to work on a cash only basis. So they tend to have a lot of cash on hand, and that's what's bringing up the average. So those countries with a very high average cash on hand tends to signal that they have a large underground economy. Let's go to other measurement problems, but I want to cover those in the second part of our video series. So this is where we're going to end it for this part.